Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for I, Mud, which is episode 12 of season 2 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek The Original Series, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the episode I, Mud. So I, Mud is the episode where Kirk and crew have the Enterprise hijacked from them by an android who takes them over the planet of androids, which is controlled by their old nemesis, Harry Mudd. Harry Mudd says he's going to take over command of the Enterprise and strand the crew there on the planet of androids, but then the androids betray Harry and decide to strand all the humans there and go off on an adventure to sort of subdue humanity in a plot to protect them ultimately. However, Kirk and crew come up with a plan to overload the android circuits by acting very strange and being contradictory, which the androids can't handle, and they all short circuit. And then Kirk leaves Harry Mudd stranded on the planet with a series of androids of his ex-wife to nag him eternally. I mean, if you're familiar with my channel, you know that I don't like Harry Mudd. He is one of my least favorite characters, and I don't like him. That being said, this is probably the least offensive episode he appeared in, at least in the original series. Like in Discovery, the one with the time loop was probably better than this one. So that was the least offensive one. And the short trek was okay too. But the other one, when they were in prison, that one was terrible. And his appearance in the animated series was also very terrible. I counted that as one of the worst episodes of the animated series. And yes, I reviewed Mudd's Women already, and that episode is absolutely horrendous. This episode is not that bad, but I don't particularly like it either. It is, it is actually, to be fair, I think it is one of the more fun, lighthearted comedy episodes. But I don't like comedy episodes in Star Trek usually, and especially not in the original series. It's just got that 60s humor that reminds me of like stuff like the Brady's Bunch. I know that was 70s, but still, and just all the other stuff in the era, which I just never got into. Like it was for a different generation, and it just seems like outdated and silly to me. And that's, and I've been reviewing other episodes of the original series, and I have gotten responses from, and I think one was particularly towards Mudd's Women, was people saying, well, you're crazy, these episodes are hilarious, they're funny. And I'm like, but humor is a very subjective thing, and if you find this kind of thing funny, who am I to say otherwise? Like, you're allowed to find funny what you find funny, but I don't find these 60s humor funny. Now, it was like, there were parts of this that was kind of okay, kind of funny, like when they started miming and doing all the acts and like, oh, Scotty's dead, and wee! Like, I will admit that was well choreographed. And it was kind of silly, so it was kind of lighthearted and fun, but I just can't really get into it that much. And then there's this scene where Uhura like pretends to be like siding with the androids and betraying them for the androids, and Kirk goes up to Uhura, is like, Uhura! Like he's about to be very pissed off and yell at her and be like, great job! And I was like, yeah, that's obvious. It was freaking obvious that she was just pretending as part of Kirk's overall plan. But as I said, I always point out that I like when they use some of the minor characters more, and we see more of Uhura and Chekhov in this episode, so I'm all for that. But yeah, I don't like Harry Mudd as a character. The stuff with him particularly, I don't find funny. I never find funny. So yeah, I mean, this episode is not as bad. It's definitely not as bad as Mudd's Women, that's for sure. Like, that episode was just horrendous. So it is one of the least offensive appearances of Harry Mudd, but it's the actual plot of the episode is dumb. It's ridiculous. First of all, the trope, and I realized that it wasn't overused at the time in the 60s, obviously, but it's become overused, of androids trying to protect humanity and ultimately like subjugating them or whatever, or taking away their freedoms in order to protect them from themselves. Like, that's kind of a trope I'm kind of sick of, and it wasn't used particularly well here. And I didn't really buy how easy it was for the android to take over the Enterprise. I mean, that was a bit silly, but then once they got there, yeah, so I talked about this a lot in the lead up to reviewing this episode and other episodes that where Kirk talks a computer to death. I believe they said there were 4 examples. There was Return of the Archons, The Changeling, this one, and Ultimate Computer, which even though Ultimate Computer comes after this episode, I had already reviewed that. So I mentioned those 4 times. The Changeling is the only time I thought really, really worked for me. Ultimate Computer was actually okay as well because he kind of guilt-tripped the computer to death, which I thought was kind of cool. But Return of the Archons and this episode I mentioned before were terrible examples, and this is being the most egregious example because he's in this case he's logicking the computer to death, which isn't really like how computers work. It's like the 60s. This was a trope that actually you see a lot in the 60s and 70s and maybe even the 80s as well, where they seem to have a weird idea of how computers operate. I don't know, maybe earlier versions of the computers from like the 60s did operate like this. I doubt it. Where if you feed it contradictory information, it doesn't really understand and it overloads. Like that was a trope, and it seems like a really outdated trope nowadays, especially because it doesn't really, like, that's not how computers work. You can't just feed it contradictory information and be like, I don't understand, error. Now, I won't get into the Changeling. I'll talk again about how, because you watch my review for the Changeling, that actually makes sense. Why? Because of the circumstances, and I won't get into it, but it was more complicated than just logicking the computer to death. But in Return of the Archons and this one, that's basically what he's doing. And this one in particular, all they're doing is like putting on theater. Like, they're miming shit, and they're like, and the androids all die in short circuit because they don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to them. But it's like, any computer this complex and logical would be able to understand the concept of theater. Like, they're doing improv, basically, and being like, oh, Scotty's dead, and they're like, he's clearly not dead, and then Scotty pops up. I'm like, these androids don't understand the concept of lying. And the whole thing at the end, speaking of lying, where they go to the android and says, Kirk says, everything Harry Mudd says is a lie, and then Harry Mudd says, listen to me carefully, I'm lying. And the android's like, well, if you're lying, everything you say to the lie, then you can't be lying. But if you are lying, then blah, 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 blah. Error, please explain. Like, the computer has to be very, very poorly constructed to self-destruct. I mean, there's tons of, like, paradoxical riddles like that. And for a computer like, how can it be that complex? Anyway. I know what most people are going to say, those who would defend this episode. They would say you're overthinking it. It's just a silly comedy episode, Mark. Don't try to think it. Just go with it. But as I said, like, I don't find it funny. So I'm less willing. And plus, I find the logical flaws in the plot actively distracting and annoying. In some cases, like, there are cases in comedies I do find funny that I am willing to just go with it, or not even comedies. Sometimes episodes that I really like that have good, strong messages and they have obvious flaws, I'm willing to overlook those flaws and just go with it because it's a good episode. But when it's not that good of an episode, I'm less willing to just to overlook it and just go with it. And especially when those flaws are just really distractingly annoying, which is how I feel this whole thing with them short circuits and the androids. It's a dumb trope that makes no sense and actively annoys me. So I'm sorry, but I'm not willing to just go with it in this particular case. Now, reading on some of the behind the scenes of this episode, it is interesting that they had twins playing the various robots, and then because they have there's 6 or I think 6 is the maximum copies of the same android we see at the same time, and so they hired twins, therefore it made it easier to duplicate. So they used it because in modern times it's a lot easier. You can have tons and tons of different versions, but in the 60s it wasn't so easy for them to do this, and so that's why they could only get up to 6, and it actually helped that they had twins, so they only had to duplicate it 2 times, really. So that was interesting. I didn't know about that. And then there's the whole concept of Harry Mudd. Apparently, after this episode came out, NBC wanted to do a spin-off series of Harry Mudd. God damn it. That would be so terrible. And apparently Gene Roddenberry, they had tasked him with making it, and he actually didn't really bother with it, thank God, because he was too busy with Star Trek and coming up with other failed spin-offs like the Assignment Earth bullshit, which we'll get there. and didn't have any interest in doing Harry Mudd, which good, because that's a terrible, terrible idea. Oh my God, that would be so bad. But Harry Mudd is the only sort of main guest star to reappear. And this is excluding, background crew who don't have that big a role, like Kevin Riley and whatnot. But I'm talking about, main guest stars. The original series itself, not counting the animated series, because the animated series brought back Core and King, even though they were both voiced by James Doohan and didn't get the actors back, and also brought back Cyrano Jones. But Mudd was within the original series itself, discounting the animated series. And God, he's terrible. And then they brought him back from Discovery, which is something I really, really hated. Although I will say, Rainn Wilson's portrayal of Harry Mudd was less offensive, or less annoying, I should say, than the original series portrayal of Harry Mudd. So, anyway, let me go ahead and thank my Patreon supporters. Thank you so much for supporting this channel by giving a shout out to all my Patreon supporters. There's Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Avals, Brian A., Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very much for your support. It is all extremely appreciated. So we have a few Patreon comments for this episode. First comment is from Ricky. Another Mudd episode. God, I can't stand this character. He is not funny. He is not amusing at all. Although, to be fair, this episode isn't quite as bad as Mudd's Women, as I think that episode sucks and I hate it. Here, it's average at best. I don't find the humor in this episode funny, and I think it's so contrived that it just so happens that a guy on the Enterprise is an android, and he forced the Enterprise to go to the planet. And of course, the androids turning on Mudd was dumb and predictable. So another meh episode. Not quite terrible or one of the worst, but I still don't care for it. So my rating is a 4 out of 10. Yeah. Harry Mudd definitely is not that interesting of a character, as I talked about, and so Ricky, as usual, agrees a lot with what I had already said. Yeah, I don't find this funny, and the thing about the androids turning on them was dumb and predictable, absolutely. Alright, so next comment is from Maddie Jester. For me, this episode just gets a bit too silly and then ends with another destroying the robot or computer using a paradox, which seems to be Starfleet's signature move. As for Mudd, I'm not a fan. He's too over the top, but I read somewhere they were going to bring him back in an episode of TNG, but the actor passed away before it happened. He probably would have fit into some of the first season nonsense. I'll give this one 5 stellar androids out of 10. Yeah, that's actually pretty amazing to hear that they would thinking about bringing him back for TNG, because why do they keep bringing this character back? Like, he's not good. I suppose it's the same reason they keep doing Ferengi episodes on DS9. Some people like them. Anyway, final comment is from Brendan Neil Howells. I Mudd. I don't like this character. I certainly don't like this episode. Androids taking over the galaxy when they don't even understand humor? Give me the Terminator any day of the week. Norman says the word please is not in the android's vocabulary, but 2 Alices say please on different occasions. I didn't notice that. That's a good catch. I think Chekhov wants to have a threesome with the Alices. Let's confuse the androids as shades of Plato's stepchildren here. Harry Mudd has a shrewish wife because it was the 60s. I fell asleep when watching this crap. 3 beads and rattles out of 10. Alright, so the beads and rattles is a reference to the what Spock says to McCoy at the start of the episode, when McCoy is saying there's something off about Norman, who, turns out to be an android, and how he doesn't want to go to sickbay, and Spock's like, perhaps he's just afraid of your beads and rattles. I don't like this banter between Spock and McCoy. I suppose sometimes their banter is okay, but like that in particular, seemed very petty of Spock, and sometimes their banter is just annoying, and I think there was definitely a case in that particular case. But yeah, nice catch on the contradictory of the word please. I didn't notice that one. And yeah, Chekhov definitely wanted to have a threesome with those androids. That's for sure. But anyway, God, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this episode's meant to be silly, so I can't be too mad at it for being silly, but nah, it's just not humorous. Anyway, my rating for I Mudd out of 10 is also going to be a 4 poor. Yeah, it's not the worst episode ever. There's definitely more offensive and worse episodes of the original series than this one. Because it is kind of silly, and sometimes you can have fun with it, and the whole, Kirk putting on performances with Scotty and all them was kind of funny, but it is silly, and it's meant to be silly, but it's not that funny, as I said, and the whole plot with the androids is just dumb. It's just dumb. So I can't give this episode any more than a 4, but it's, as I said, not as offensive as, definitely not as offensive as Harry Mudd's other appearances. Anyway, that is it for my review of I Mudd. So, coming up on my channel, let's see. Where are we? So next Monday will be my review of The Trouble with Tribbles, another comedy episode, but not one that's nearly as bad as this one, but it happens to be overrated though. And then on Thursday, I'll be releasing my review for the next episode of Picard, and the following Saturday we'll be back for another TOS review with Bread and Circuses. So that's what's coming up on Enchantment of Eternity, and as I cover many other videos having to do with Star Trek and many other shows as well, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.